Okay, year 10, and welcome back to another lesson from home. Alright, so I couldn't think of a funny joke there, so I'll just leave it. Alright, yeah, so we have just been doing USA religious fundamentalism. Okay, and now we're going to be, or as I say it, religious fun. What can I say? And now we're going to be moving on to Native Americans and how they were assimilated. Now, I don't expect you to know that word just yet, but we will do this lesson, so don't worry. And we're now on, I think, current day 31, something like that, so now we've had a full month away from school, but we've only missed 10 actual days. So don't worry. So, as always, start your work with a quick starter quiz. So, what I've done here is I've given you the easier ones, and then slightly harder ones, and then I've gone all the way back to Germany and crime improvement. Alright, so make sure you've obviously got a pen and paper. Pause it now to give yourself a chance to actually answer these questions. I'm going to go over the answers in just a second. So let's get going. Just to let you know what's happened with me, I was doing this in the kitchen because I got a table there, but the washing machine started going crazy, so I am now on a tiny table on my knees in the front room, which is starting already a minute in to get painful. So fun. Alright, so let's go through some of the answers. What did the monkey trial fight over? What it actually fought over was if evolution should be taught in schools. So it was about evolution versus creationism. Okay. Who won? So you can talk about William Bryan plus creationism and Tennessee, but you could argue that they were made to look a bit silly, and therefore you could argue that over the long term maybe evolution won, but a bit more of a stretch. How many communists were arrested in the Palmer raids? That is 6,000. 6,000. What law reduced immigration to 150,000 a year? That was 1929 Immigration Act. Alright, should be able to remember. Act means law, immigration, immigration. What was the first immigration restriction? 1917 literacy test. What was the first quota of immigration set at? 3% of 1910 levels. Or 3%, fairly good answer, but of the 1910, that's pushing you into a better category of answer. Okay, so Germany, how did Hitler control the youth? You can talk about that keyword beginning with I. Indoctrination. If I can learn to spell, there we go, got it. What did Konrad Adenauer do to West German economy? Make it recover. You could say he invested. Industry improved, taxed the rich, gave people jobs. Right, almost the opposite of East, whose economy suffered because they had to pay reparations and because the communists didn't quite organise their society correctly. Oh, my knees are starting to hurt now. What did Dawes Plan do? Reduce reparations, well done, to not 2/3. 2/3 is Young Plan. To a manageable, can you see that last bit? So, to a manageable level, and that was in 1924. What did King Charles create in 1663 to help policing? The Charlies, well done. What trials were used in the medieval period? Trial by combat plus trial by ordeal. Oh, turn your phone off, Mr. Halpin. How dare you? How dare you have your phone out? Alright, and then what was a change to... let's turn that off. What was a change to punishment in the modern era? A change to punishment in the modern era was more rehabilitation. Banning or making illegal capital and corporal punishment. So that's executions, and that's hitting people. So remember, they used to hit children in schools. My dad remember getting a cane a few times. Alright, so remember how to set your notes out. Key ideas on one section here, key notes here, and then at the bottom a summary. So what you're going to do is today's lesson, you're going to be writing in here. At the end, you're going to come back to it and give it some, and reduce this to 6 keywords, and then a few days later you're going to come back and summarise it. Alright, so our lesson is looking at Native Americans and how they're assimilated. So we need to know what we mean by Native Americans. You may have heard of them as American Indians. Okay, and what they were, these were the first people to live in America. That's what native means. Native means sort of, first people, first group. Your native homeland is where you came from. So my native homeland is Wales, and some people say KFC. Alright, so there, let's close that door. Native Americans, and I do want to just stress this, in the GCSE we obviously can't go into too much detail about everything, but when we talk about Native Americans, it's not just one group of people. There are huge variations in different groups of Native Americans. They're not just one specific people. But what we can say is they used to live in things called teepees. Okay, I think of them as sort of tents, but that's my understanding of them. Obviously, it's not quite what they'd think of it. So this was actually made of buffalo hide, and a whole family would live in there, and then they'd move that around. So they lived in teepees. They lived in tribes. Now a tribe is a group. Now what I've done here in this picture is, so this is one tribe here. They've got their teepee, and they're in a family, they're in a group, they're in a tribe. Now they may speak one language, because they may be one tribe. Another tribe would speak a completely different language. That's how I've got these the opposite way around. So different tribes were, in some ways, very, very, very different. They even had different languages, different beliefs. So you can't just say all Native Americans were the same. So different tribes, but they lived in these groups. They hunted an animal called the buffalo. Okay, and I've got to say, quite honestly, that is the most amazing picture I've ever seen. Downloaded that straight off the internet. It's uncanny how similar that is. Now the way I think of this is a massive, massive cow. Now this they used to use for everything. So have you ever been licked by a cat? And it's got like this scaly, it's got this sort of scaly sort of feel to it. Well, the buffalo's got a similar tongue. So what they would do is they would dry out the tongue, and they'd use the tongue for a hairbrush. They used the skin for belts and for the teepee, so it gave them a place to stay. They used the brains to soften the skin to make it able to be turned into a teepee. They used the stomach for cooking, so they would use make the stomach a cooking pot. So when we say they use everything in the buffalo, they really did, because that was what they survived off. So the buffalo was special to them. Now this then leads us to our next part of Native American cultural life. Now what I will actually do, pause it, and let's go back to our notes, okay? Pause it and go back to our notes and make a few notes about what Native Americans, you might want to say, lived in tribes. Something like that, okay? So just give yourself 30 seconds to try and keep up there. Alright, great. So, nomadic. What nomadic means is that they don't live in one place. So as you can see in this picture, they're moving around the country. They're moving around the USA. Yeah, different directions. Now one reason why they did that is because they followed the buffalo around. If the buffalo gives them their food, their equipment to build houses, well then they're going to follow it around, aren't they? So they literally follow the buffalo all around the country. So that makes them nomadic. Now that is a really, really important key word that we need to make sure. So make sure you've got that in your notes. Don't forget to pause it, obviously. And they had a spiritual belief. Now, what this isn't a religion. Okay, so it's not like Christianity. It's not in a god. But as you can see in this picture here, what I've done is I've drawn nature. So they believed nature was really, really important. So certain trees would have certain powers for them, or a certain mountain range would be very spiritual for them. Would be in, you could say it's like a god. Okay, so those mountains would be very sacred. They'd go over there. They might make a sacrifice to the mountains because they thought that then helped their world be created. So, for instance, maybe a river coming down off the mountain. They'd be like, well, the river helps us drink, therefore helps us survive. Therefore, the mountain is sacred. Right, so that was Native American culture and how they lived. Now, the reason why we're looking at these is because basically they are seen as inferior by white Americans. Inferior means not as good as. So if you've ever heard someone say, oh, they look down their nose at someone, that means they feel they're inferior. So you might have white Americans up here, and they'll be superior because they think they're better. Now remember, I'm saying they think they're better, I'm not saying they are better. And then you might have Native Americans here. And they may be called inferior, not as good. So white Americans thought Native Americans were inferior, and therefore they persecuted them. They attacked them for being themselves. So they attacked them because they're Native Americans. Said, you're different, therefore I'm persecuting you. They treat them very differently and they almost attack them. Okay? Now what I'd like to do is pause this, go back to your notes, make sure you've got a really, really good understanding of everything we've just looked at. Okay, boom, it's that time again. It is work time. So what I'd like to do, this is going to include a bit of recall, because remember we can't just forget any information we've learned. What I'd like to do is answer these two questions here. What group is the majority in the USA? Because that is going to help you understand who is attacking Native Americans. Then what I'd like to do is, what groups have we learnt about being persecuted in all the topics we've looked at? So in the USA, in Germany, in crime and punishment. Don't limit yourself to two, you may be able to think of more. So pause it and try and answer these two questions now. Right, I'm going to go through the answers now. Let's do it in black pen. So I'm going to give you this as a bit of a hint. What's that stand for? Links to religious fundamentalism, links to anti-immigration feeling. So you've got white, Anglo-Saxon, that's religion, Protestants. Okay, so you could then say religious white people. So they're the ones doing the persecution, really. Then what other groups have we learned about being persecuted? Communists. If you want to be specific, you can name 2 communist anarchists. And 2 immigrants as well. So you could say Sacco plus Vanzetti. Now if you're not sure who they are, I advise you to go back over your notes and have a quick read through them, because those 2 are really, really important people. Germany, you could talk about Jewish people. You can even say, to some extent, some religious people who were persecuted. You could talk about the youth. Remember the swing youth, White Rose, those sorts of groups. And then crime and punishment, you've got 2 religions, persecuted at different times, Catholic, Protestant. So if you want to give yourself a quick memory, how did the religions change over time? So we had Henry VIII, then we had Edward, then we had Mary and Elizabeth, and he went from Catholic to Protestant to Catholic to Protestant. So if you think you're Catholic there, you're fine. Then you're Protestant. Then you're being persecuted because you're wrong. Then you're still being persecuted. Then you're being treated nicely. Then you're being persecuted. Right, now what I'd like to do is answer these 2 questions. How the Native Americans seem to be different to the majority of Americans, and how might this change? And I'm just going to stretch my legs because they're killing. Alright, pull yourself, give yourself some time to answer these. Alright, so how they seem to be different, and think about religion, think about where they live, think about what they eat or hunt. Think about how they live. So you could talk about here, they're not Protestant, they're spiritual. You could say they live in teepees and they are nomadic. Now I've got pins and needles in my foot, great. They hunt buffalo. How they live in tribes. Don't speak English, not English. Okay. Now how might this change? Just have a think, how might you think this might change? And that's what we're going to look at on the next lesson, on the next couple of minutes. Okay, so now we're going to get into that next bit of the topic that I'm looking at, is assimilation. Right? What does assimilation actually mean? And what I'd like you to do is use this picture. So use this picture here to tell me what you think assimilation actually means. So pause it to give yourself time to actually answer this. Okay, so assimilation means to make Native Americans more American. To change them. So in this picture, you can see this person's hair. These are the same people, by the way. This is before assimilation, and this is after. So this person's had their hair cut. They've had their jewellery, which is spiritual to them, taken away. They've had their clothes completely changed. Remember, the clothes, like I said, are spiritual to them. Okay, and now we're going to look at what else changes in this point of assimilation. So, right, before, how were they? If they moved around, they were nomadic. They lived in tribes. They were spiritual. I just had to erase to be able to turn the charger on. They were spiritual. They also hunted buffalo. Okay? So now these are going to change. Let's get you so you can see all of those. Right, great. So, this is before assimilation. This is after. So, after assimilation, instead of being nomadic and running around the country, they had to live on reservations, and these still exist today, and some Native Americans still live there today. So a reservation is a place for Native Americans to live. So now they weren't allowed to roam around the country. They had to live in one spot. Right, and I've got a quick video here to show you how the Native American lands change. Okay, so this here is where this here might be all of the different tribes in Native America. Now, this is how it changes. So the green is where Native Americans were allowed to go and did go, because they thought they owned the land because they were the first people there. So now it's starting to be reduced. So now, as Americans come into the country, or as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants come into the country, they start taking land away from the Native Americans. So it's really started to reduce now. So that's what it's like 20 years before we've looked at. And now that's what it's like today. So I'll just let this play through one more time. And remember, these weren't just lands given by the Native Americans. Sometimes wars were fought over this. Okay, so that is how Native Americans went from being nomadic to living on reservations. Okay, so in 1887, they owned about 138 million acres. Acres is a distance, an area of land. And then in 1934, they only had 48 million. So a massive, massive reduction in where they could live. Now, to change the tribes and to change the language, because looking at like these are two different tribes. This may speak one language, this may speak another. They also had names like Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse. Okay, some really, really amazing names, sort of spiritual to them. They didn't have a religion, but they had a certain way of thinking that was special to them. Now, after assimilation, they were sent to a boarding school. Now, a boarding school is where you live and work. So imagine you just go to normal school, but a boarding school is where you go there and you sleep there. Think of it like Harry Potter. Harry Potter is a type of boarding school because he lives there, doesn't he? With all the other witches and wizards, although they don't exist. So here, they would learn to be Christian. They had to learn about the Bible. They had to learn to speak English. Okay? So their whole language was changing. They were being forced into this. Their clothes changed. So you know how we said about how sometimes their clothes look spiritual to them? This picture here shows you how the clothes are changing. They had to wear more shirt and tie. Okay? They had to wear trousers. They had to wear a certain thing. They had to cut their hair. Okay? Now they weren't allowed to hunt buffalo because they were only allowed on certain areas. So this was how assimilation changed Native Americans. Now what I would like you to do, because there's quite a lot of keywords we've looked at, what I'd like you to do now is I would like you to give a definition for each of these and tell me how it relates to the lesson. Okay, so pause it to give yourself time. Alright, and I'm going to go through it. So I'm just going to put NA for Native Americans quicker. Actually, Native Americans moved around country hunting. I'll pause this. Okay, so there's my chicken scratch. I'll just get this in a better way for you to see. Right, so nomadic, these were Native Americans moving around the country hunting, often buffalo. Reservation, this is where Native Americans lived after assimilation, or where they were forced to live, is a better word. Boarding schools, where children were assimilated, remember using those keywords to learn English and how to be American. Spiritual beliefs, this is what Native Americans believed before assimilation, so for instance they believed heavily in Mother Nature and how important it was. Tribes, the groups or communities Native Americans lived in before assimilation with their own languages, beliefs and dress. Now dress means how they get dressed, so their clothes, so that's going to be important in a second. Assimilation, how people were changed to be more American, for example their language, their dress, so their clothes and the beliefs. Inferior, Native Americans were seen to be not as good as white Americans. Americanized, this is to make people be more like white Americans. So for instance they were made to be Christian, speak English. Education, this is how children were assimilated to be Americans at boarding schools. Now what I'd like you to do is just have a think about what does assimilation actually look like in relation to something we've already learned about. how does it look like in relation to something we've already learned about in terms of Germany? It looks quite a lot like indoctrination. For example, you could say the boarding schools were like the Hitler Youth. Remember those the English speaking lessons that they're being told could be like the maths lessons where they were talking about how Jewish people were inferior. Okay, so it is very, very similar. Now, last little bit. So, after boarding school, they still had to become American. Okay, so it wasn't just school and then that's it. If they didn't become American, they weren't allowed to vote. So they didn't get to choose the president, they didn't get to choose who was in power to rule over them, really. So for instance, imagine if they hate reservations, they hate them, and they want them to change. Well, in America, you can only make change happen by voting for someone who wants change. So to vote, they had to do certain things. They had to become American. To become American, they had to pay taxes. They could have joined the army, or they could have married an American person, American woman at this time. If they pay taxes, they then have to get a job. If they're getting a job, well, they have to speak English, they have to turn up, so they have to live in one area, so they can't be nomadic. So paying taxes and having a job, this was a way of making them American. If they didn't want to do that, they could have joined the army. Okay? They join the army, they become American because they've given a service. Or they could have married an American person. Now, do you think they're going to be able to marry an American person if they're not Christian? Probably not. So, again, they're going to struggle to do this unless they've already assimilated in some way. And they did all these things to become American to vote. Now, what I'd like us to do now is to have a look at our notes. Have a look at our notes and make sure we've filled this section, just this one, in now. Okay? Completely fill it in about everything we've looked at about Native Americans. Now, what I'd like you to do is, if you think about the changes we looked at here, what I'd like you to do now is I would like you to rank the changes of assimilation in order of most harmful to a Native American. So, for instance, if you think living on a reservation is the most damaging because it limits where they can go, it limits what they believe, you're going to put that at the top. If you think the buffalo, not being able to hunt buffalo is harmful because they can't get all the things that they need, put that at the top. So create a list, tell me why one thing is more important than the other, and then this will help you for the next section, okay? So I think you should probably spend about 7 minutes of this to get them in order and then to tell me why they're in that order, because that's the most important thing to this learning here. Right, what I would have said there, I can't go through the answers there because they're so different. It's just entirely what you argue. But my argument would be the ones that are most important, the ones that limit or change the way a Native American person thinks. So for instance, the changing of their spiritual belief, I think, is very, very harmful, because what that's teaching them is it's teaching them that what they're thinking is wrong. And when you're at a young age to be taught that, it's very, very detrimental, so damaging to your mental health. Alright, now the red zone that we'd like to do, that's going to cover the most of this lesson, is what was the effect of assimilation on Native Americans? So what you need to do is you need to identify the changes, so don't look through your notes, let's do it just off the top of your head. Then I would like you to discuss all of those changes. How is it showing a change? So for instance, you might say they were now no longer allowed to be nomadic. Why is that a change? So they now had to live on a reservation, they lost this much land, blah blah blah. Oh, but don't say blah blah blah, obviously, because that's not going to get any miles. And then what I'd like to do is say why each of these things might cause harm. Okay? So remember, you got my email, send me the red zone so I can have a look at it, so I can mark it for you. That should probably take you around 9 minutes. Okay? What I'd like you to do is give it through once, then look through your notes, see if that can help you. Okay. Then, after you've done that, go back to your note page. Alright, read through these, cover them up, and come up with 5 or 6 key terms that represent this. So if you were going to cut this down to 6 words, what would those be? After you've done that, a couple of days later, try to remember everything you've learned. Then after you've done as much as you can in one colour, in a separate colour, use the keywords here to help. Then after you've done that, use a third colour, read all of this and all of your work and see if you can add anything else, okay? Alright, so as always, it's been a pleasure. Stay safe, good luck, and keep trucking on. Alright, see ya.